Welcome to Exchange Traded Fridays, brought to you by ETF.com. I'm your host, Paul Curcio, managing editor of ETF.com. Joining me today is ETF.com's superb team of writers and editors. Senior ETF analyst Sumit Roy, senior content editor Kent Thune, contributing editor Ron Day, and we have a special guest today, editor-in-chief Kristen Myers. Welcome, Kristen. Welcome all. We have a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. This past Wednesday, ETF.com celebrated its biggest night of the year, the 2025 ETF.com Awards. It's a celebration of the best the ETF industry has to offer. There were 18 winners in total in a very, very competitive field of nominees. So, Kristen, what would you say was the biggest surprise of the night for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The biggest surprise was actually how difficult I think some of these awards were, particularly in the ETF of the year category. A couple months ago, when we released the final nominations, Eric Balchunas, who's over at Bloomberg, and also one of the judges, compared it to, I believe it was the 1994 Oscars. Anyone else can keep me honest on this one, and just exactly how difficult it was. In that year, I believe they had Shawshank Redemption was up for an Oscar. And this year is no different. I mean, looking at that category, you have nukes, that's the range nuclear renaissance, or the Renaissance range nuclear ETF, and you've got IBIT, that's the iShares Bitcoin ETF. I just think that to me, the biggest surprise, more than, a particular fund winning an award, was truly how difficult and how close I think some of these categories were. ETF of the year is one, Crypto ETP of the year is another. And so that's what I think some of the biggest surprises were. But of course, VOO clinched VOO, clinching I always say VOO. Do you say VOO? Do you say
I say
VOO?
VU.
Yeah, VOO clinching the ETF of the year. IBIT, of course, taking home the crown for crypto ETP of the year. So I don't think those were surprises, but I think that the stiffness of the competition definitely was.
So I would say that for me, VU was the no-brainer. That if you
Yes.
were going to choose an ETF of the year, it had to be because it's just so totally outperformed. Sumi, tell us a little bit more about that. Would you agree that VU was on your
Uh,
no-brainer list?
I'm kind of on in the middle on that. It is a no-brainer in the sense that it's not surprising to see that VOO won that category, but you could have made the case that IBIT deserved ETF of the year as well, right? That was one of the most talked about stories. I think IBIT was a no-brainer for best new ETF. Nothing even comes close in my opinion, but you could have made the case that IBIT was also ETF of the year. But of course, Vu had just such an exceptional year, $100 billion plus worth of inflows in 2024, by far the largest inflows we've ever seen for an ETF. In fact, that continues this year. We've talked about how Vu already had $50 billion of inflows this year. So this ETF has just been on a tear, and it's now the world's biggest ETF. So yeah, I think it did deserve it, but there was some competition there between Vu and IBIT. Of course, Vu ultimately won that heavyweight battle.
Kent, anything surprise you in the results this year?
I don't think so. I mean, I have to go back and say I could cheat, Kristen, and I saw that it was the 1995 Oscars, but I
Damn.
wouldn't have get. I probably wouldn't have guessed as closely as you. So we got to give you credit for that.
I was only
Uh,
seven, guys, all right? So
but
cut me.
I could even cheat so far. I could see what the nominees are. But Shawshank Redemption, probably my favorite movie of all time. But you also had Forrest Gump and Pulp Fiction in there. So, but in this case, with you've got the ETF of the year, you've got the best new ETF of the year. But IBIT won twice. So they got the new crypto ETP exchange traded product of the year as well. So maybe the judges were like, hey, maybe we got to spread the love around. But anyway, all those nominees are deserving. One, key or one of the many different data points that I look at is that during or last year, 2024, IBIT amassed over $50 billion in assets under management within its first 11 months. That's the most successful launch of all time. So that's one mind-blowing thing, if you want to call that surprising. But in terms of the outcome, no. Now I was impressed with JAA, the Janus Henderson CLO ETF. It was new ETF of the year, best new ETF last year, and it's coming back again this year. And now I have to look and see what was the one that it won. Let me look. Yes, the active ETF of the year. So that's Janus Henderson AAA CLO ETF. So it was new ETF last year. So that's a repeat performance. So that was a little bit of a surprise, but it's deserving as well.
If we're talking about surprises, I just want to chime in here that I was surprised by the fixed income ETF of the year, the best new fixed income ETF of the year. That was awarded to the AB short duration high yield ETF, ticker symbol SYFI. This is essentially a short duration junk bond ETF, that one. I was a little bit surprised because we do already have short duration high junk bond ETFs on the market. There's one from iShares that's an index-based product, SHYG. This is an actively managed fund that competes with that. So, there is a case to be made for this, but there was some other ETFs in the category that I thought might have gotten the nod instead, like the CLO ETF from Bond Blocks. We've talked a lot about CLOs and things like that. Private credit, that was on the nominees list, but it didn't ultimately win. So I was kind of surprised to see the junk bond ETF win.
The NVDL, I guess, would be kind of a no-brainer. The NVIDIA winning for the NVIDIA long leveraged ETF. I mean, that was really made a lot of headlines all year long. It was when we were looking for something to kind of talk about the success of leveraged, and just, of course, last year, following NVIDIA and NVIDIA going through the roof through 2024. That one really stood out. And again, seems like kind of a no-brainer to me for the category.
And Kristen, you had a follow-up?
Well, it's just to what Sumit was saying about the junk bond ETF, SYFI. That's what I'm calling it anyway. I play around with how I choose to pronounce some of these funds. But essentially, I think that what you were talking about, Sumit, is I think it's a good point, but I think it also shows about the desire and the drive towards active, particularly in certain segments. And I think that that's what some of the judges were probably going for. Not sure. We haven't asked them, but we maybe
Sure.
could or should.
It's a good point. Good point.
The desire to go maybe more towards into that active space. Now, the private debt and private credit ETFs that we're seeing, and we're seeing more of those ETF types pop up, they seem to be a little flash in the pan because we're not actually seeing the fund flows follow into those areas. So they're obviously a product that has hit the market, but I'm not entirely sure that it's a product that investors have really been clamoring for or demanding. So I can understand why, in some ways, yes, it's innovative, but is it innovation that the market really wanted at this particular point in time? And so maybe that's why the judges kind of moved away from that area, particularly in that category.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if you look at kind of the data, the SPIVA report tracking active versus passive, fixed income funds historically have had a better chance and a better track record of outperforming indexes. So this is an area where fixed income can potentially shine, whereas, in equity funds and things like that, historically, they have not fared very well, especially compared to the indexes like the S&P 500 tracking funds and things like that.
As pointed out, this is probably one of the toughest fields that have probably been out there for nominations this year. Which category do you think the judges had to make the hardest choice, where all the nominees felt like they deserved to take the trophy home, unlike 1995's Oscars?
Yeah, we look at these nominations, the hundreds and hundreds of nominations from the very get-go, and I can tell you now, from an investor, as an advisor, and here at ETF.com, looking at these ETFs, the fixed income space is the most difficult. It's the most complicated space in terms of capital markets as well. So if I'm a judge, I'm putting myself in their shoes. I would say, especially that active ETF space that fixed income they were just talking about. because there's so many different things that managers can do to provide alpha, to outperform the indexes. And it's also a very complex area of the market. I mean, there could have been a dozen or so different funds that would deserve to be nominated in this category, whether it's fixed income or active or both. But yeah, when I combine active and fixed income together, those two things are complex and more difficult to decide.
For me, it was emerging market. Emerging markets is a fascinating category in general, I would say. And I think that it became even more difficult in 2024 with the elections, what we knew was kind of coming down the pike, and the, I think, increasing interest that we have seen towards international. And so this was a pretty interesting category, especially considering all the like geopolitical almost kind of maneuverings that we saw throughout 2024 that have carried now over into 2025. So this list, I think, was particularly difficult. We have one ex-China ETF in here. We do have a China ETF. Argentina pops up in this list. So I think emerging market was also a very interesting, but also somewhat difficult category to kind of go back to if we're going to look beyond the ETF of the year category, which is always, of course, the most difficult.
And just to mention that Global X's Argentina ETF, ARGT, was the one that prevailed on Wednesday. So very interesting. Sumit.
Leveraged and inverse ETF of the year. This could have gone in any direction. These are all speculative tools, of course, but how do you decide between a 2x long NVIDIA ETF and a 2x long Mag 7 ETF? They both are very volatile products designed for short-term speculation. There was also a concentrated Qs inverse ETF in there. And of course, the biggest leverage ETF on the market, the heavyweight TQQQ, the 3X NASDAQ ETF that was on the list as well. These are just different flavors of speculative tools. And it's really difficult to, choose which one is the ETF. The best leverage ETF of the year. It really could go in any direction. So I think that was a really tough one as well.
And of course, it went to Granite Shares, and it's NVDL ticker.
Yeah, well deserved given, NVIDIA was the hot stock of 2024. So I could see why the judges went that way.
All right, let's see. Kristen, the judges had their work cut out for them this year. I think that's something we all agree on, and it's come up over and over again. Could you just share with the audience who they are and why they were chosen? What was part of the process that brought them in?
Yes. So we had, I believe it was seven judges. Here's the name. So we have Eric Balchunas, senior ETF analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence; Margarita Chang, CEO of Blue Ocean Global Wealth; Debbie Fuhrer, managing partner and founder of ETFGI; Nate Geraci, president of the ETF Store; and quick plug, also my co-host on the ETF Pulse podcast, Lois Gregson, senior ETF analyst from FactSet; Ben Levine, he's the CIO from 3D, which is a Freedom Advisors company; and Aniket Ulal, SVP and head of ETF research and analytics for CFRA, and also a member of ETF.com's editorial board. I believe there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, 7 people. So I did count it out correctly. So just so everyone kind of knows how the judging works very quickly, we come up with the nominations, we pass it on then to these judges who then make their decisions and don't tell us. And they also have blind voting as well. So they actually don't even know who the winners are until the night of the award. So they found out on Wednesday, along with everyone else, who won. And they even recuse themselves if they're in a category where they are perhaps nominated. Bloomberg, for example, has been nominated for an award before. So, Eric has recused himself. Nate Geraci was a nominee last year for Best Education Provider, which he did win. So he had to recuse himself from that. But yeah, we kind of put it in the judges' hands. And, just from hearing that list, these are incredibly well accomplished and esteemed individuals in the ETF industry that just have decades and decades and decades of experience between them, and they always do an incredible job. So a tough job, and I'm glad we don't have to be the ones to do it, because it was difficult, honestly, wrangling the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of submissions and nominations that we got down to the about 85 that we ended up with, those finalists. That was difficult enough. I'm glad I didn't have to be a part of picking the finalists. I don't know if I could have done it.
We sure did give them a tough job. And I have to say that it was a really intense process going through all of the nominees, well, not nominees, but all of the entries, hundreds and hundreds per category, and whittling them down. And there were a lot of tough decisions to make just in that round among the editorial team here. So this everybody that won on Wednesday night, they deserved it. So bravo to them. All right, last thing I wanted to bring up is that this year we had 6 new categories. Is that a record for new categories in one award? I wonder.
I think it is. I'll jump in and say I believe that it actually is. We did have, I think, 3 new categories last year. We now have 6 this year. So some categories we pulled out, some we added in this year. But yeah, that is a record. But I think, again, reflects where the market is going. I mean, Sumeet was mentioning NVDL earlier and just the leveraged inverse. Well, Ron mentioned NVDL earlier, and Sumeet was mentioning the leveraged inverse category in general. That is an entirely new category for this year. And I think we look like geniuses, frankly, because it is a category that is raking in absolutely billions amongst the market volatility that we've seen so far in 2025. And so I think that that's just a statement of where the market is headed in this space. And yeah, we have service providers. I think it truly is a far more inclusive awards in the sense of we are now looking at and touching every single kind of space and corner as a part of the ETF industry. And so I think we've got a good number of categories here, but who knows, next year we might have some more new ones. We'll have to see what kind of innovation comes out in 2025.
Yeah, stay tuned for next year. Ron, so would you round out the roster of new
categories? Yeah, I mean, there were 5 types of ETFs. Crypto, which I guess that, again, we said probably the no-brainer was that IBIT, the iShares Bitcoin Trust, won that one. Commodities is a new category, which was the PDBC, which didn't really have a bang-up year as far as performance, but it's a new if you read its description, it's a little difficult to understand. There's a bunch of different things going in, but the ETF industry is always its jobs is always to craft new types of things for new types of investors, just to keep covering new ground, which clearly the people did this year or last year. Active ETF was the collateralized loan obligation JAAA from Janus Henderson. That one. Emerging markets, as we had mentioned before, was the Argentina ETF. NVDL aced the leveraged and inverse category. And the non-ETF category, the non-product, was best service provider, which obviously is somewhat of a difficult one to judge because we all know these people. We want to make it as objective as possible. And the winner, of course, is Tidal Financial, a name that crops up a lot on our radars because they do design ETFs for other companies and then, kind of a white label ETF creator. So, yeah, definitely interesting batch of winners in the new categories.
It certainly was a night to remember, and we want to thank the event sponsors, Clear Street, Advisor Pros, CRSP, Eagle Capital Management, Fundstat Capital, Gregory FCA, Innovator ETFs, Invesco, MSCI, NEOS, S&P Global Market Intelligence, Vanguard, and Vident for their support. And thanks to all our listeners for streaming or downloading Exchange Traded Fridays. Remember, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you have a question or just want to share your thoughts, join the conversation with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, where our handle is @ETFCOM. See you next Friday.